Let's talk about petrol taxes, carbon taxes, the whole lot there with electric cars. Analysis from the Australian Automobile Association shows that a higher uptake of EVs, electric vehicles, will result in a huge drop in fuel excise revenue or petrol diesel taxes, which could fall from $13 billion a year to below $11 billion a year. So a shortfall, $2 billion a year. Let's bring in my economics panel to discuss this and more from Melbourne business commentator Terry McCrann and from Sydney Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood. Well, it's one thing to bring in the electric cars and spend all this money getting them out there on the roads, Ross, but you've got to look at what you lose in terms of budget revenue, don't you?
Well, you sure do. And you've also got to ask the question, who is paying for our roads? Because right now it is petrol excise that they're talking about here, that as a result, any person who gets onto a road, effectively by when they fill up their tank, they are helping to pay for the roads and for the infrastructure. And that's a part of the key of the excise on petrol. Now, in Australia today, there's around 21 million cars. Now, the Prime Minister says he wants 1.7 million electric vehicles. He's not been as ambitious as Bill Shorten, who said it should be 50% by 2030. He says 1.7 million. That's about 8% of cars. Right now in Australia, 1.5% of the cars or the vehicles on Australian roads are electric vehicles. And the reality is, even though that might be good for the planet, might make you feel good, the reality is they're getting a free ride from every other motorist on the road who pays more tax. And that's the reason why, if you want to have more electric vehicles, the owners of those cars, through registration or through some other form, have got to pay more tax. There's no doubt.
The reality, though, Terry McCrann, too, is if you're charging a car on the grid right now, the national grid, the grid is 70% weighted in coal power, you are charging an electric car on coal power, which has higher emissions than petrol or diesel. So you actually got a worse emitting car, if that worries you, than if you had stuck with an internal combustion engine. But I don't hear the Green Lobby talking about that.
Well, no, Peter. I mean, clearly the Green Lobby operates in a fantasy world where you assume that by the time we have all these electric cars, we will all be using electricity that comes from wind and solar, and maybe battery powers when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine. But the bottom line reality in all this, as Ross indicated, is none of this bears any relation to the reality of either budgets or where does the money come from. And we're focused on, this is just one side of the equation, that we're going to lose the revenues that you get from the excise, fuel excise now on petrol-driven cars and gas-driven cars. But it's not only that side of the budget, Peter, as we all know, it's the other side of the budget, and not just the budget, actual household expenditures, where we are in for spending hundreds of billions of dollars to subsidise so-called green energy. So on the one hand, we're going to lose money from the budget by not using those very reliable sources. On the other hand, we're going to cost everybody even more money from forcing them to use the unreliable sources of energy.
Yeah, and here we were thinking that it's a market economy in Australia. Ross, last month, Australia's prudential regulator moved to take the heat out of the housing market by raising the so-called serviceability buffer used to assess applicants for home loans. It followed months of warnings from banks and experts that house prices were rising too quickly. Now, according to documents obtained by the Australian newspaper, both APRA, which is the regulator, and the Reserve Bank were looking into home loan controls as early as February this year. Now, does that mean they were too slow to act?
Oh, well, welcome to the real world where they're always too slow to act. They're always reactive and always after the event and always terribly cautious about things. You know, there's been a home price boom building in Australia for all of the time since they took interest rates to near on zero. Now, it suited them at that stage to get a bit of demand going in the economy, because as soon as you get a person buying a home, you get them buying furniture, you get them renovating, you get a whole lot of jobs created as a result of it. So that's the logic. But you understand that they're also getting a little bit scared that ultimately affordability is simply disappearing for a lot of first-time buyers, and indeed people end up getting squeezed out of our capital cities because they're squeezed out of the housing markets. And so this is the reason why. But understand that especially in APRA's case It's all about banking stability, as it is with the Reserve Bank. What they're really worried about is that people take on mortgages that are way too big, that there is some shock at the end of all of this, and really those people can't afford it, and that ultimately hurts the banks, which have just come out making record profits over the past 12 months in enormous recoveries that they've had.